when you hear about China on the campaign trail, it's usually from former President Donald Trump when he's talking about tariffs.
I put tariffs on China, but I put 27.5%. Otherwise, we'd be flooded with Chinese cars. And all of our factories would close. We'd have no jobs at all in the auto industry. That goes for...
It's worth remembering, tariff is just a fancy word for a tax on imports that is eventually paid by the U.S. consumer, and that the Biden administration is currently using them too. But when you hear Vice President Kamala Harris talk about China, the warnings sometimes go beyond the economy.
Recall, Donald Trump actually shipped advanced semiconductor chips to China, which helps them upgrade their military. Understand the impact of these so-called policies that really are not about a plan for strengthening our prosperity or our security.
Whatever rhetorical differences, it's fair to say both campaigns see China as a threat. The current Biden administration does too.
A new era of panda diplomacy marks our worldly today. Giant pandas Bao Li and Qingbao are right now on their way from China to Washington, D.C.'s National Zoo on a chartered FedEx plane.
So why did we just welcome in two extremely cute giant panda bears to our nation's capital? My guest is CNN senior national correspondent David Culver. He was right there in China as the pandas took off for the U.S. We're going to talk about the strategy behind panda diplomacy and why Beijing's recent military maneuvers around Taiwan might make it seem like a bit of an empty gesture. From CNN, this is One Thing. I'm David Rind.
It's so weird being back. I was based in China for 3 years, from 2019 through 2022. Part of that time I lived in Beijing, and then part of that time I lived in Shanghai. And if you align what that timing was, it was, of course, during the outbreak of COVID here and around the world. But obviously here it was a very special situation, as they like to call it, a special period. So this is the first time I'm back in Beijing since the Beijing Olympics. I got off a flight just a few hours ago from Chengdu, China, which is southwestern China. It's in Sichuan province. And I was there for the panda send-off.
Well, so you're back to cover pandas? Like, I don't want to question how our bosses spend money. Like, the more reporting trips, the better, obviously. But, like, why was this a moment you had to be there in person?
Are you questioning how important pandas are, David? I mean, no.
How dare you? I would never.
Don't question the pandas. This is something that I've always been interested. Candidly, I'm not, a panda fanatic, right? But growing up in the DC area, the National Zoo, having pandas was always just something of course I enjoyed, but I was fascinated by the underlying panda diplomacy aspect, especially, having lived and covered China in this space, wanting to really pull back the layers to understand, how high up this really goes. And we know it goes up to the presidential level. I mean, just go back to November of last year at the APEC summit, and in a dinner with a bunch of business leaders, Xi Jinping brought up that pandas would likely come back to the US. I mean, so it goes all the way to the top. And on another level, I was curious just about the hype around it and, why people are so enthralled with these creatures.
Well, so tell me kind of the backstory. Like, where did this all start?
The panda diplomacy is more than 50 years old now. It goes back to 1972. So that was really tied to the historic visit from then President Nixon coming here to China.
The hill path is rather steep and it's not so easy to climb up probably, so we don't invite you to go up today.
Well, I'm game.
And in that visit, the First Lady, Pat Nixon, was at a dinner with Premier Zhou Enlai and made a comment of her visit at the Beijing Zoo. And what she remarked was, "I really like those pandas you have." And he goes, "Well, I can send you some."
Do you have any ideas for names in case you got a couple of these from Mr. Zhou? Well, no, I'm sure that they won't be for me. They'll be for the American people, and somebody else will have a chance to name them. Maybe they already have names.
And that started the conversation of actually sending 2 pandas over to the National Zoo in Washington. And that began panda diplomacy. And from there, obviously, the U.S. began to come to really appreciate these creatures. But around the world, we saw China would be sending them out as ambassadors of hope, of goodwill, but also it was a strategic tool diplomatically to solidify relationships, especially during rocky times.
It's like you can have these amazing creatures, and that kind of signifies that we're good people here. We can talk to each other. We can have this dialogue.
It does feel like these are creatures that are being used in some way to keep the channels of communications open. But candidly, they were on the brink of extinction. We know that the pandas were endangered. They've only recently gone from endangered to vulnerable. But it's interesting. I heard one person quoted on this saying, initially, this all started to help save the pandas, but it may now just be that the pandas are going to be saving us. And if you pull back the layers on that, you do see that this is really shocking that panda diplomacy is continuing right now. Tensions are really, really challenging between the U.S. and China, and we've seen them ramping up over recent years.
Yeah, I want to get to that. But first, tell me about this specific handoff. Like, how did it work?
This was something I've always wanted to see from the Chinese side of things, because on the U.S. side, we know what it's like for sending pandas back to China. We've seen the Panda Express, so to speak. That's the big FedEx aircraft, the 777 that's wrapped with the pandas on them.
Not associated with the fast food joint.
Totally separate from that. There is the only thing being consumed is bamboo on board, and lots of that. So what I wondered was, what goes into a transfer of these pandas from China, 7,000 miles over to the US. And so we started these conversations early because trying to get this type of access is very challenging. But if you just candidly explain that you genuinely want to know the people behind the pandas and what plays into this, it seemed like there was a desire to show us some of this.
各位旅客，欢迎您来到成都双流国际机场。机舱外的温度。
So we flew here to China, into Sichuan province in southwestern China. That's panda country. It's beautiful. It's mountainous. It's lush. We're going to go now and meet up with the folks from the Smithsonian National Zoo in Washington who are here in Chengdu. While we were there, we wanted to really understand a couple of things. One is, what are the pandas that are in captivity undergoing? Essentially, what is their life like?
He's snoozing. They're trying to wake him up.
Oh my goodness, that's so funny. I feel like if I had keys to jingle, he's way back there.
I was like, if only we
And then what are the efforts to conserve pandas in the wild looking like?
I mean, these bamboo forests are kind of keystone ecosystems, and giant pandas are the key to saving those ecosystems. So when you save a giant panda, you're not just saving that species, you're saving all of the species who live in these places and the places themselves.
So there's a huge trickle-down effect from this.
Yeah, there really is.
And obviously for U.S. zoo goers, it's important to know from the conservation side of things who these 2 pandas are that are coming over. And we know they're Baoli and Qingbao. Baoli has a connection to Bao Bao. It's actually Bao Bao's son. And Bao Bao was at the National Zoo, was born there.
As much as we are excited to welcome the pandas to their new home in Washington, D.C., we also know that the people in China are sad to see them leave. And so today is really a moment to mark their departure from China and to celebrate their time here, and also remind people that they will be going to a happy place in their new home.
So we were part of this panda send-off, which candidly was kept very quiet. They didn't publicize a lot around this, which is really interesting, David, because you would think that this would be a very big send-off farewell party, but there's a lot of emotions tied with pandas here. Some folks are not all that happy to be sending them off. That's a very fringe vocal group. And the others would probably just want to rush the airport or rush the send-off to just get a glimpse of the pandas going from point A to point B. We were given access, but we were told this is strictly embargoed. You cannot talk about this. You're going to meet us at this point. The Chinese officials were able to take us into an area where we then waited for a few hours outside of one of the Panda bases. And then we were told, okay, now you're going to walk through this corridor and meet us at this end of a driveway. And we were alongside a few other Chinese state media. And suddenly it was just right in front of us on a forklift, a panda in a crate, and you could see Bao Li, the first one, moving around. I mean, I was just a few feet from him, and I had never been that close to a panda. It was pretty striking to see.
I don't think it has the color. I can see him.
You see her in there?
Yep.
All right.
And the crate was mostly open. You could see just through the plastic barrier the faces of first Bao Li and then Qing Bao, and they were super active, moving around. You could see their bamboo that was their in-flight snack, and they were being prepared to be sent off right from Chengdu onto the U.S.
They're called giant pandas, right? Are they actually giant?
Bao Li looked big. He looked like he could, yes, I think fill the name nicely of a giant panda. He looked like he was super active, and he's said to be very energetic. He likes to just keep moving. Qing Bao is a bit more petite. I feel so strange describing pandas this way, but she's a bit more petite. She's smaller. She likes to eat and basically take long naps, and doesn't always listen. She's seen as Miss Independent. It's funny knowing these personalities from the caretakers, and they describe them as such, but they spend so much time with them that they really do begin to develop these relationships.
Bao Bao was our first cub, and so Bao Bao holds a special place in my heart. She also reminds me a lot of my daughter.
Really?
Well, my daughter was very young at the time, so we made a lot of the comparisons. Bao Bao she was always very independent.
So you were raising two at the same time, essentially.
It was, and they were so neat.
And it's very emotional. Each caretaker that we spoke with on the Smithsonian side and on the Chinese side likened them to their kids.
And
what is that like to see your baby have a baby?
Well, especially to have our baby come back to Washington, D.C. Oh my goodness, I can't wait.
And when they're sending them off, for example, now the Chinese caretakers sending them off to the U.S., they say it's like sending your kids off to school. And it's hard because you know it's a necessary part of life, and yet it's still a separation. And the U.S. caretakers have said the same thing when they have to send them back to China.
The same Bao Li, Qing Bao, have a safe trip.
And it was not only the caretakers, but you had some of the administrative folks, even security, who were lined up with signs saying, Bao Li, Qing Bao, have a safe trip. And they were chanting it as the trucks rolled past and headed to the airport in Chengdu.
I'm Dr. Sanjay Gupta, host of the Chasing Life podcast.
It's October, Breast Cancer Awareness Month.
Breast cancer does not run in my family, and yet here I am with stage 3 breast cancer.
That's anchor and senior national correspondent Sarah Seidner. She revealed her diagnosis on air to the world this past January.
It is hard to say out loud.
Listen to Chasing Life, streaming now, wherever you get your podcasts.
So you mentioned how panda diplomacy can kind of tell us something about how China interacts with other countries all over the world, including the U.S., and that the U.S.-China relationship is incredibly fraught right now. So what exactly are the sticking points right now when it comes to the U.S. and China?
Where do we begin? I mean, it's all over the place right now between these two countries, the world superpowers. The U.S. right now is really focused on a few things when it comes to how they're dealing with China. And it's in a few different areas. It's with regards to national security, of course, and artificial intelligence. Fentanyl is a huge issue, and it's one that the U.S. looks at the precursors and knows they come from China, which they go on to Mexico. They're then made into finished fentanyl and come right over the border. So the U.S. is trying to go to the source with that. And when you look at just regional conflict, you see obviously what's happened with Russia and Ukraine. China is very cozy with Russia. President Xi Jinping and President Vladimir Putin, they've labeled each other as best friends, and they have a relationship that knows no limits. That's how they've described it. China has also been very adamant in saying that they will reunite with Taiwan and that is not going to be questioned by the U.S.
So the Joint Sword 2024B drills are now in the history books with a new record for the number of warplanes, and China not ruling out future military activity near Taiwan as they see fit. Again,
earlier this week, China sent over a record number of warplanes into Taiwanese airspace. And so this is something that's been monitored over the past couple of years. And now we're seeing the number of aircraft from China that's clearly in a threatening and seen as a harassment of sorts from the Taiwanese perspective.
There were also 14 Chinese naval ships detected, but none of those actually entered Taiwan's contiguous zone, which is 24 nautical miles from shore. That would have been a major escalation in and of itself.
And it's something that also the U.S. is looking at as a very likely next step, being potential efforts to take Taiwan.
I want to ask you about a commitment that CNN has reported President Xi made to President Biden when they met in November. We've reported that he told President Biden that China would not interfere in the upcoming presidential elections in the United States. But since then, there have been reports of online Chinese accounts that have falsely mimicked Trump supporters.
Well, there's not even just the stuff in the region, right? Because Secretary of State Antony Blinken told CNN at the end of a trip to China in April that the U.S. has seen evidence of China trying to influence the upcoming U.S. election.
Look, it's something we're tracking very carefully. I can't speak to these specific reports. I can say that as a general matter, we've been very clear with China. Don't do it.
But they're not violating the commitment yet, as far as you can tell?
Well, again, I'd have to look at the specific reports that you're referring to, but we have seen, generally speaking, evidence of attempts to influence and arguably interfere, and we want to make sure that that's cut off as quickly as possible.
So is there a sense of who Xi Jinping would want to win the election? Because both Kamala Harris and Donald Trump really talk strongly about countering China in a number of ways.
It does seem to be the number one foreign policy punching bag, so to speak. They both like to show their tough on China stance. The official line from the Chinese is that they do not get involved in other countries' domestic affairs, and they ask other countries to do the same, stay out of China's business. And we've seen that with a lot of the accusations of human rights abuses here, where China has said this is nothing to do with the U.S. The U.S. needs to focus on its own issues, of which there are multiple, as the Chinese put it. Xi Jinping with President Donald Trump saw a very tumultuous and I think unstable relationship. We saw tariffs, obviously, that have sustained under the Biden administration. And that's been very, very harmful to the Chinese economy. The Chinese economy right now is struggling greatly. They're trying to find ways to infuse some sort of boost, but it's not been successful yet. And so when you look at who potentially would be leading the U.S. and their relationship with China, it does feel like they would want to avoid another Trump presidency, and they would like to at least sustain somewhat of calmer relations, which they have seen under President Biden. That said, it doesn't seem like either has been a glowing win for the Chinese, particularly from an economic perspective.
Well, yeah, I realize that China is a pretty difficult place to report from. They routinely censor CNN's TV signal when we report on anything remotely critical. So, you know, having been there during COVID when things were just really hectic and scary for a lot of people, what is your sense of where this country is at post-COVID and at a time where Xi Jinping has consolidated power to such an extreme extent?
I thought COVID would be the indicator of China's future. And by that, I mean the strict quarantines, the heavy monitoring, the state surveillance at unprecedented levels. Living here at that time, we had to use QR codes that would just basically allow us to be tracked from point A to point B to point C. Everywhere we were under that type of surveillance. And even leaving China in the midst of the Shanghai lockdown in May of 2022, I had to get special permission to leave my neighborhood. And that even came from the ambassador himself and the embassy helping us get a letter just to say, David's allowed to leave his community. And
just to leave the neighborhood.
Just to get out. And I promised not to return. That was part of it. until COVID had passed.
Wow.
And so it showed you that those measures were so extreme. Driving through the streets of Shanghai as it was just shuttered in the midst of the devastating lockdown, it was quite depressing. It was really sad to just see a city that was so full of life come to a halt. And I thought, this will never come back. This will never be the same. And returning here, I was proven wrong. I mean, just seeing that COVID, if you walk around the US, you'll notice there are stickers that say 6 feet apart that are kind of faded. You'll see all kind of the remnants of COVID era. You don't see any of that here. It's like it's been scrubbed completely. And life is back to normal. It was back the way it was in 2019 when I first moved here. And part of that is it's quite refreshing, quite frankly. I mean, you just feel like they were able to push past it and return to normal. But it also shows the necessity of having to resuscitate an economy.
Right. There's still economic struggles even years later from all that people are dealing with.
Right.
Well, David, thanks so much. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, David.
One Thing is a production of CNN Audio. This episode was produced by me, David Rind. Our senior producers are Felicia Patinkin and Fez Jamil. Matt Dempsey is our production manager. Dan Dzula is our technical director, and Steve Lichtai is the executive producer of CNN Audio. We get support from Haley Thomas, Alex Manisseri, Robert Mathers, John Dianora, Lainey Steinhardt, James Andres, Nicole Pesseru, and Lisa Namoral. Special thanks to Avelio Contreras, Wendy Brundage, and Katie Hinman. We'll be back on Wednesday. I'll talk to you then.
Follow every moment of the election with CNN. More stories, more insights, and more exclusive election tools like the Road to 270 interactive map. Subscribe for less than $1 a week at cnn.com/subscription.